So, here to talk with me about all of this is Colin Clarke. He is the executive director of the Soufan Center and an expert in terrorism, geopolitics, and international security. He also is a researcher at the Rand Corporation and taught at Carnegie Mellon. He's testified before Congress. He has briefed the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Air Force Special Operations School. He also was an analyst working under H.R. McMaster, who became Trump's national security advisor in his first term. He worked under him as an analyst in Kabul. So, welcome. And
Thank you.
let's talk about how we got to this day. Was this the result of Netanyahu's attacks on Hamas in Doha that allowed Trump and his administration to exert more pressure on Netanyahu? Was it Jared Kushner getting involved and taking a more optimistic approach? Was it that everybody's just so tired after 2 years of this brutal war that everybody decided to say yes? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me. It is indeed an historic day, and there's a lot of potential here. That's my kind of word of the day is potential. Whether or not that's ultimately fulfilled is yet to be seen. I think out of what you laid out, probably all the above, uh, you know, pushed this deal over the line. But I do think Netanyahu's miscalculation in attacking Doha gave the Trump administration what it needed to finally kind of ram this deal home. And I think, Bibi overplayed his hand in that case, and he lost a lot of leverage because you could see the very visceral reaction of the Trump administration to those attacks against a U.S. ally, right? And the countries who have been trying to shepherd an agreement for the past 2 years were not only attacked by the Israelis, but were hit by the Iranians, and so it's not a good sign to those who want to help make peace when the chief negotiator, one of the sides that's leading the efforts, is bombed by both belligerents. Um, but I do think in that way, if you almost look at it as a sacrifice, that was able to kind of really be the catalyst that was ultimately what got us to this point now. Again, I'm a bit pessimistic that it's going to be all rainbows and cupcakes from here. There's a lot of really important details still yet to be hashed out, including Hamas disarmament. But this is a really good first step, right? It's
Yeah.
2 years of fighting, really, really brutal, vicious fighting. And not even as an analyst, as human beings, we should all celebrate and end to the current conflict.
Right. And we'll talk about some of that in the about half hour that we are talking here today. The president talked this morning about countries coming together even when they didn't like one another. We know that he had businessmen as opposed to real diplomats behind a lot of these decisions. What are the lessons that other countries should be taking away from this moment? Countries like, I don't know, the US, Egypt, Qatar, and other stakeholders before we start getting into the Palestinian enclave as well as Israel.
Yeah, I think, look, credit where credit is due. The Trump administration fought really hard here to maintain focus, right, and did so in an unorthodox way. You mentioned, the people like Steve Witkoff and others who were involved weren't your kind of traditional diplomats, and maybe that's okay. It still ended up working out in the end. But I think that the Trump administration made it very clear that it wanted a deal here, and it invested the resources and the bandwidth necessary to make that happen. If you look at the kind of actors involved, the Egyptians, the Qataris, the Turks, they all say it wouldn't have happened without the administration. And so, a lot of people like to poke fun at Trump for constantly talking about a Nobel Peace Prize and his obsession with it. In this case, it warrants serious consideration. If this is a deal that's able to hold, and look, and I've been on the record speaking out against a lot of President Trump's policies that I disagree with, but I think to be respected as an objective analyst, you then have to kind of again, I used the term earlier, give credit where credit is due. And this is an area where I give the administration fairly high marks.
Yeah, he'll have to wait a while, but this is such an important moment, and uh, so it's also interesting to note, though, where Iran is. I mean, Iran was invited to this meeting, and they declined, but still welcomed the war ending, especially for the Gazans. Uh, why don't we talk about what it means for them for a moment?
Sure, let's talk about Iran because I think the Iranians are over in Tehran licking their wounds. They've come out the worse for wear when you look at all the players involved here. I think even worse than Hamas in some respects. Hamas is going to use this conflict to, uh, to rebuild their image and to kind of recruit new members, and they're going to portray this in their propaganda as a heroic victory. But the Iranians, have been badly beaten down. Their axis of resistance has been left in shambles, and that was the centerpiece of their foreign policy. Their nuclear program has been, depending on who you ask, either decimated or at least left in pretty bad shape. And as much as you kind of look around the region, they become somewhat of a pariah, even more so than before. And so, without Hezbollah, without Hamas, without some of the Iraqi Shia militia groups, with a weakened Houthis in Yemen, the Iranians are really, I think, at a nadir in terms of regional strength, but also in terms of um, diplomacy, right? And there are countries, rogue countries, that still continue to deal with the Iranians on a regular basis, but a lot of that's out of necessity of oil.
So, when we think about the future of Gaza and how it will be run and the countries that could be exerting influence here, which countries do you think will be playing a seminal role? And is Iran too weakened to actually be able to execute anything right now?
Probably, and I think if you look at the countries that helped shape the deal, the United States, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey. If the UAE gets involved in providing troops for some kind of internal stabilization force, right? Who's got skin in the game? And the Iranians, if they do get involved, uh, a lot of times it ends up just being in a nefarious way, right? And so if they're trying to smuggle weapons into the West Bank or into Gaza to send money to help rebuild Hamas, that's not helping. Right?
Right, of
What
course,
everybody's trying to build right here.
but are you saying that we're not going to be seeing that right now?
I think, look, there was, I think, a bust last week of Iranians trying to smuggle weapons into the West Bank, which is why I mentioned that territory in particular. We've seen them, trying to do the same in Syria, right? After kind of the Iranians and the Russians have been, booted from Syria, they're still trying to maintain a toehold there. Yeah, they see this as a form of power projection. They've invested a lot over the years into Hamas, into Palestine Islamic Jihad, and they're not willing to just walk
Mhm.
away at this point.
So,
So I think we will continue to see more of that.
okay, so well, let's set aside Gaza just for a second here because you brought up the West Bank. That is where people have major concerns right now. Do we need to be worried about that as we think about the fact that this is a great day for Gaza and Israel?
Absolutely. The West Bank will continue to be a flashpoint, right? And so there's a struggle for control there. You've got some far right Israeli ministers that are pushing the envelope there. And I think it's a real flashpoint.
And
We could see.
Netanyahu has also turned a blind eye to the settlers and
Correct.
what they have done to foment the crisis.
Exactly. And I think we have to look at this holistically. So, and also just take a look at some of the images out of Gaza. Reconstructing Gaza is going to be expensive. It's going to take a really long time, and there's no guarantee that it'll succeed. Um, you know, could there be a group that rises from the rubble that's even more extreme than Hamas? That's not
Mhm.
totally out of the realm of possibilities. We've seen that, throughout the Middle East before, where a kind of splinter group kind of emerges and then becomes even more extreme than its predecessor. So there's so many unknowns here.
Right.
I used to joke about the old Yogi Berra line. I gave up making predictions, especially about the future. And then my caveat was, especially when the Middle East is involved, because it's really easy to get things wrong.
Yeah, who would have ever thought that Iran would be in the state that it's in and that Syria would be where it is? Big surprises out of the Middle East in the past year. But if we go back to Gaza specifically now, um, how can one do the work to ensure that Hamas is no longer a force that is going to be governing, whether it's under its own name or a different name, to destroy the massive web of complex tunnels which they operated from? How does that work happen?
That's a great question, and I think that's why we haven't seen a lot of details on that because it's such a thorny issue. It's such a complex task and undertaking. When I was at Rand, I was part of a team that looked at probably 3 or 4 dozen what we call DDR campaigns, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration in all parts of the world, and kind of glean lessons learned and best practice from that. And I can tell you, more often than not, these things fail. Moreover, in DDR, there's typically some kind of promise of political power to the insurgents or the violent non-state actors involved to get them to surrender some of these weapons. Here, the Israelis are demanding full disarmament and that Hamas, has no governing role in a future Gaza. That's going to be really hard to do. So, what's their incentive to give up their weapons? And where do they go? So, I think to me, there's more questions than answers at this point. Which countries are willing to kind of put money in and have skin in the game in that respect. And then,
And
what
yeah.
does the peacekeeping force look like? What are the rules of engagement? What do force protections mechanisms look like? There's so many questions once you start getting into the details here, and I haven't heard many good answers.
Yeah. And will there be a consortium that is managing the enclave?
Right.
And how will they deal with conflict and disagreement? I mean, when we look at the way Netanyahu has behaved, what role does Israel play in all of that, too? There are so many questions here. I mean, when I think back to these 2 years and few days that we've now gotten through, um, Hamas had refused to give up all of the hostages. They realized that the hostages would be a point of leverage for
Yeah,
them.
of course.
But it also meant that more than 60,000 Palestinians would be killed, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. So what is the lesson for terrorists who have looked at the trajectory of this war? Are they going to think, well, if we just grab some hostages ourselves, then that means that we can extend this and exact some cost? Or will they say, look at the way this entire area was absolutely razed. It's not worth it. It doesn't work for us.
I think um, both of those things, right? I mean, it depends on which group you're talking about, depends on the adversary. Will every country that's facing an insurgency be willing to go to the lengths that the Israelis have in terms of attempting to destroy their enemy, right? Some would argue probably not. Others would say yes. Uh, the first two big projects I did at Rand were on counterinsurgency, and one of the and we looked at all insurgencies from the end of World War II to 2009. So there were 71 in total. And one of the main lessons we learned was what we call the scorched earth campaign, where you just go in and totally raze a place, is often counterproductive, right? It's kind of winning the battle and losing the war because it plants the seeds of your future adversary. And so that's something that I'll be watching for closely here. And it's one of the primary concerns I have, which the way the war was prosecuted. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, warning about this Israeli mission creep, getting kind of sucked in here and then being unable to extricate the IDFs. Think back to what happened in Lebanon, South Lebanon, 1982. The Israelis didn't plan to stay for 18 years, but there they were. And so, how involved is Israel in what happens next in Gaza? And is there a possibility that they get sucked back in saying, look, I have security concerns. We need to be a part of this, right? There's, again, a real slippery slope challenge here.
And what do the Palestinian people want? Who would they choose?
That's the question you often don't hear, right? what do the Palestinians want? We hear about what the United States wants, what Egypt wants, what the Israelis want. You rarely hear about what the Palestinians want. And I would argue it's not Hamas. It may not even be the Palestinian Authority because of high levels of corruption and previous, examples of ineptitude. That's a great question. It also gives you a sense of the scope of the challenge here, right? To come up with some kind of leadership out of a population that's just been traumatized. I'm not talking about people in Hamas. I'm talking about civilians and the kind of future of that country, what people just live through. It's going to be a massive challenge, even with, uh, you know, e- even if countries are able to give resources and kind of contribute to making this into a livable space again. Even with all those things lining up, it's still going to be very difficult.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many countries will actively want to support the Palestinians because they have very vocally talked about how they don't like Israel, they don't like what Israel's doing, and yet they have not extended support to the Palestinians. Is there more compassion and more strategy involved moving forward? In a way, almost like when you think about what Netanyahu did in Doha and what that led to, is the destruction of this going to actually also be a lesson for those countries? But I also want to think about Netanyahu himself right now, because
Sure.
in the course of trying to destroy Hamas, which we all knew was not possible, you can't destroy any group based on an ideology. I mean, we still have ISIS, we still have neo Nazis.
Yeah.
The groups continue, but in the quest to try to destroy an organization that wanted Israel to end, has Netanyahu, through the conduct he has displayed in Gaza, ultimately created more communities that are inherently anti Israel?
Yes, there's no question about it. And I think one area that's going to be incredibly myopic when we look back on it, and how short-sighted what Netanyahu has done is the loss of support among Americans for the state of Israel. There's some Pew polling data on this. I think it's also different by generation, but like the Gen Z folks in this country are going to look much different in terms of how they view the state of Israel than I think previous generations have. And there's a number of reasons for that, some of them fair, some of them probably unfair. But I do think it was incredibly selfish the way that Netanyahu went about kind of prosecuting this war, and ignored multiple potential off ramps because he wanted to save his own skin. He wanted to prolong the war in order to um,
Avoid the corruption
Oh,
cases.
yeah, and then also to make up for being in charge when October 7th happened in the first place, right? He had to kind of string this out so where he could claim some grand victory, because he was asleep at the wheel when October 7th happened. He was in charge, remember? Netanyahu was the one that greenlit a lot of these payments to Hamas because of in his mind, if Hamas was governing Gaza, they were fat, happy, and rich. Not rich, but were getting paid, and so the threat was minimized. And
Right. And he spurned the more moderate Palestinian Authority, which was another aspect of catering to the far right Israelis who were protecting him as he was being investigated, and calls for him to step down were underway. And those things don't go away, and neither does the question around the intelligence community. I mean, the drama in Israel's intelligence community the with the reports that they put out about why the threat of October 7th was missed. I mean, it just feels like there's so much work ahead for Israel. For Gaza, it's tangible, like you can see it. But
sure,
for the Israelis, I feel like it's almost more abstract and it's invisible, but they have a shit ton to do too.
yeah, there's a lot of soul searching there, and a lot of pain and trauma on the Israeli side too. Um, and I think a lot of kind of second guessing and Monday morning quarterbacking of like what if he had taken an earlier deal? What if these corruption charges weren't hanging over his head? Would he have behaved differently? And did he have the best interests of Israelis, hostage families, and the IDF in mind with each and every move? And I think there's a lot of people that would argue no, that he was looking out for himself, which is, you know, an incredibly counterproductive way to think about your country's political and military strategy.
It is interesting, though, that in his conduct, he also changed the map in the Middle East in terms of threats. And that is why we saw Iran weakened. That's why al-Shara was able to
Yep.
topple the Assad regime. And so far, what we're seeing out of Syria is a more hopeful picture where the United States is playing a role and the Russians and the Iranians have less ability to operate. So some of Netanyahu's actions, when we're not talking about the Palestinians per se, but some of that, I think a lot of people are really grateful for at the same time.
No doubt. I mean, you look at what we would call the second order effects of Israel's military campaign in the region, weakening Lebanese Hezbollah, which in turn, was a group that kind of bolstered Assad. Without Hezbollah there, to have Assad's back, the regime was far more brittle than many imagined, including myself. I think it's important to be honest about these things because after the fact, everyone says, "Oh yeah, I saw that one coming." No way. Nobody saw HTS barnstorming through the country in late December, and install. I mean, anybody who said that they, predicted Al Shara and General Petraeus sharing a stage at the UN, is if they're telling you that, they're lying. That was still, blazoned in my mind as this remarkable image. And look, Syria's not out of the woods either yet, right? There's a lot of hope and a lot of promise, and I think, you know, um, it's a great thing to see as a human to see a country after 13 years of civil war to
Mhm.
have the prospects for peace. But again, the country is being led by a former leader of Al Qaeda in Syria. I know he's saying the right things. He's doing the right things. He's got the McKinsey makeover. He's got nicer suits than I do, that's for sure.
He's got
Uh,
some very expensive watches too.
right? So he's balling.
Yeah.
But what happens if someone kills him? Does that plunge the country back into, sectarian strife? Syria is nowhere
Mhm.
close to being out of the woods. That's a
Right.
very precarious situation. I mean, we're all kind of, celebrating the progress, but you're right. To go back to your original point, that would not have happened without what Israel has done in the region, and has really, I think, exposed the Iranians as well. On paper, they looked a lot stronger than they actually were. It also proved just really how wired Israeli intelligence is inside of Iran. I mean, we're able to kind of reach out and do almost with impunity whatever they wanted against the regime, against the IRGC, and against their terror proxies.
It was absolutely extraordinary to see the kind of placement and access that the Israelis had,
Yeah.
not just in Iran, but in other countries to include Syria and Lebanon. Truly outstanding, jaw dropping as a person who covers the intelligence community to
Yeah, it
just,
was out of a Hollywood script.
it was. And in fact, it was probably cooler than most Hollywood scripts in my book. But uh, speaking of the intelligence side of this, it seems clear to me that we'll still see Israeli intel going after members of Hamas that they have not picked away yet, who they consider to be threats.
Yeah.
Is that going to upend any sort of delicate peace in Gaza?
It could, depending on how it's done and where it's done, right? So if the Israelis start conducting operations inside Turkey, for example, or another country, then yeah, you could bet that it will have a destabilizing impact. We know the Israelis have long memories, right? If you look at the 1972 Munich Olympics, right, and the kind of lore
Yeah.
that grew out of that. And so if I were a Hamas member, I'd be sleeping with one eye
Right.
open at night because at some point or another, Mossad is going to reach out and touch you. But the Israelis also have to be careful not to kind of upset the apple cart in some of these other countries. Look, I'll go back and use a well-worn and somewhat hackneyed saying, but be careful. It's the devil you know and the devil you don't, right? And so sometimes we see this with this campaign of target assassinations, and including with Hamas. You go back to some of its early leaders. The people coming up the pipe, after them, sometimes are younger and more extreme. So you really have to be careful with this kind of high value targeting, targeted assassination campaigns because sometimes you're
Mhm.
unleashing a more nefarious force.
Yeah, I remember back in 2014 with the rise of ISIS, and when you learned about uh, how they slaughtered old men and took women to be sex slaves and children. I mean, the level of horror and repression, the brutality of it, felt even worse than Al Qaeda. If we, although of course they didn't commit a 9/11, but it was gruesome in its own way. Um, and I mean, there was something else I was going to ask about Hamas now, and that is that while we have seen the living hostages be released and they will have a lot of therapy and medical testing, and it's going to take them time to reintegrate. It's not an easy process. I've talked to enough freed hostages to understand that. There are also people who died and whose remains have stayed with Hamas. They released the remains of 4 people, but it's unclear if more will be released or if they even know where they are. Is that going to be a source of contention as well? And could it jeopardize anything?
Look, anything could jeopardize the deal. It's that fragile. It's that tenuous. So yes, it could. I think there's also a logistical challenge sometimes in getting these remains out. There's no trust at all between most of the parties involved here. That's eroded significantly, and so that was a big challenge of the Trump administration was to get mortal enemies to the table and to agree to a deal. So even kind of seemingly minor incidents absolutely could have the effect of, you know, really kind of plunging both sides back into a conflict that everybody says they no longer want. But we see this all the time. Again, I mentioned the study I did at Rand. Some of these cases in West Africa, if you look at the brutal civil wars there in Liberia and Sierra Leone, dozens of ceasefires that were reached and then broke back down. And this is something that I'm going to be watching on a daily basis, right? It's not something you can kind of say, oh, we'll see where things stand in a couple of months. You're going to have to be watching this kind of day by day to see how the needle's moving, who's saying what, and then at the end of the day, who's actually ponying up resources, right? There's a lot of talk. This is a great summit that is taking place in Egypt, but when everybody goes home and starts dealing with their respective problems in their home countries, who's still maintaining focus and bandwidth on what's happening in Gaza?
Hmm. Well, certainly a win for Egypt today, and probably something that people in Doha are wishing happened there. But, Colin, really appreciate you coming to chat with me, since I know this has been a day where your phone has just been dinging and ringing, and it's a historic moment. So getting a
Thanks for
chance
having
to
me.
speak with you about it has been really important, and you have provided a lot more to have us worry about. So thanks for that.
I appreciate you having me on. It was really nice speaking with you, and I hope to be able to join you again in the future. Maybe we'll have some great things to talk about. How I was wrong, and I should have been more optimistic.
Well, and as a journalist, I have to say that things don't always work out in such a rosy way. Also, I just want to note every time the Soufan Center has a conference, crazy huge things happen.
That is
This was
correct.
when the
Correct.
attack on Doha happened. This
Tuesday
was when
morning.
Charlie Kirk was killed. This was when the Iranian leader got killed in the helicopter. I
Yep.
mean,
Correct.
when's your next conference? It's in May, right?
It's going to
So
be in April, I think.
oh shit, you're
Yeah.
giving us so little time. Please consider changing that. Um,
Thank you
okay,
for
thanks
having me.
to
I
everybody
appreciate
for
it.
watching. If you liked this, please consider becoming a paid subscriber so that I can keep doing this work and living in this super expensive city of DC and potentially, hang out with Colin. So I'm gonna go now. That was so awkward. Bye, everybody.